Most founders think that scaling is about better strategy. And yes, obviously having the right strategy is important, but what I've seen from coaching nine-figure CEOs is that the next level, it usually comes down to something else entirely. Because the real gap is often in standards, identity, self-honesty, and the decisions that most people keep avoiding. At that level, the CEOs who scale aren't usually the ones working harder. They're the ones willing to evolve before the business forces them to. I'm Byron Morrison. I'm the author of The Effective CEO 2.0. And in this video, I'm going to break down 9 things that nine-figure CEOs understand that most founders don't. Everything that I'm sharing with you is based on what I've learned from working with CEOs in 18 countries to become the leader their business needs. The first is you get what you tolerate. Most founders think that culture is what they say matters, whether it's a line on a values page, something said in a meeting, or a standard they believe in. But culture is what gets tolerated. Because if a deadline gets missed and nothing happens, then that's now the standard. Or if someone underperforms and you let it slide because the conversation feels uncomfortable, then that's now the standard too. Or if people keep turning up half prepared, avoiding ownership, or blaming circumstances, and nothing meaningful changes, then that's your standard your business is actually running on. Nobody has to announce it because you've already communicated with your inaction. One thing I hear all the time from the first time CEOs I work with is they want to be the leader that people can actually turn to. And while their intentions are admirable, what tends to happen is that they tolerate bad performance, and even when they know that something is wrong, they avoid addressing it. Often it's because they don't want to upset people or be difficult, but it's also because it makes them uncomfortable and it's a part of the role that they don't really want to deal with. So they find ways to justify someone's actions, or they let things slide again and again. Then they wonder why standards across the business have quietly drifted. But what most people miss is that what you tolerate never stays small, because the first time you let something slide, it feels minor. The fifth time, though, it's a pattern, until a few months later, you're dealing with a much bigger version of the same issue and you're wondering how it got there. Well, it got there because of the first time you let it pass. One of the biggest things to realize is that having tough conversations and holding people accountable doesn't make you a bad person. If anything, it's part of the role, and it's completely possible to handle these situations in a way that's aligned with who you want to be. One thing I coach clients through all the time is the realization that you can be firm and still be fair and kind. And you can care about people and still expect more from them. But the longer you avoid that, the more your team learns that standards are optional. The second thing that nine-figure CEOs know that founders don't is that what made you effective early on will eventually slow the business down. Because in the early stages, being hands-on works. If anything, the way you build traction and momentum is by moving fast, solving problems yourself, and staying across every detail. But that way of operating will only get you to a certain point. And this is one of the most disorientating things that founders go through, because once you reach that point, it doesn't feel like the business changed. It feels like you got worse. Because at that stage, you're still working hard and trying to stay on top of everything, yet somehow it's not creating the same result that it used to. At this point, many overwhelmed CEOs convince themselves that they're struggling with motivation or discipline, or they have bad time management. When in reality, it's not that they got worse, it's that the job changed underneath them. Because what made you effective early starts becoming the bottleneck later. The reason this happens is in the early days, your primary focus was on building traction and getting the business off the ground. But once you scale, on top of driving revenue and growth, you now need to lead a growing team, keep stakeholders happy, all while overlooking the day-to-day operations. It's a huge amount to stack on top, which is why the behavior of being across everything that once worked, it now starts creating a ceiling, as the business has outgrown what you can carry. And this is where a lot of founders get trapped. They keep doubling down on the same behavior that made them successful. You'd be amazed how many times I've had application calls with founder CEOs who want to hire me because they want help to become more productive. They've convinced themselves that if they can just get better at managing their time or find ways to be more efficient, then everything will become easier. The problem, however, isn't a lack of time. It's that they're not effectively using the time that they have, as they're stretching themselves thin and trying to do the job of multiple different people. That's why as you scale, the behaviors that once built speed will eventually slow it down. That's why this is never just about growth. It's about outgrowing your own default way of operating before it becomes the thing holding everything else back. The third thing that nine-figure CEOs understand that most founders don't is that the role has to be redefined at every stage. This follows on from the last point, but it deserves its own moment because most founders never actually sit down and think about it properly. Because the CEO role at 2 million in revenue isn't the same job as the CEO role at 20 million. And the role at 20 million isn't the same job at 50 or 100. That sounds obvious when you hear it like that, but most overwhelmed CEOs don't actually behave like it's true. What happens instead is the business grows, the complexity increases, the team gets bigger, and the stakes get higher. Yet the founder keeps trying to do the version of the job that they had 2 years ago. Yet now they're inside a business that's completely outgrown that version of them. Then they wonder why they're busier, but somehow less effective. And they wonder why the company feels harder to lead, even though on paper things are going well. The problem is that no one hands you a new role description when the business hits the next level. There's no moment where someone sits you down and says that the version of the job that got you here isn't the version the business now needs from you. So a lot of founders just default to what they know, where they stay close to the work that they understand. They solve the problems that they feel comfortable solving, and they fill their time with whatever feels urgent or easy to justify in the moment. I see this constantly with the CEOs I work with. They'll tell me they're more capable than ever, yet somehow they're more stretched thin than ever as well. And usually when we dig into it, it's not that they're doing more, it's that they're still doing the job from 2 stages ago, just at a much bigger scale. The CEOs who scale well, though, they understand something different. They know the role has to keep being redefined, so they keep asking themselves, what does the business actually need from them now? What can only be done by them? And what part of their role hasn't been updated yet? Because when the role is unclear, everything still feels like it could be yours. And when everything feels like it could be yours, you end up staying involved in far more than you should. Now, the fourth thing that nine-figure CEOs know that founders don't is that your identity will keep pulling you back into the weeds unless it evolves. Most founders think that getting out of the weeds is purely a delegation or systems problem. And sometimes it is. But more often than people realize is that what stops those changes from working is actually linked to the identity of the person letting go of the tasks. Because a lot of founders build their entire identity around being the one who's needed and who people come to when something goes wrong. If anything, they thrive on their ability to solve problems and make things happen. And again, in the early stages of the business, that's often how they needed to operate. The problem, however, is at scale, that same identity becomes the thing quietly working against them. Because now, even when they build the right structure or they hire the right people, something in them keeps pulling them back into the middle of things. Not because the business actually needed them there, but because being needed still feels like proof that they matter. It's an easy trap to get stuck into. And the reason that happens is for a lot of founders, they tie their value to their output, meaning that if they aren't involved, they don't feel useful or like they're adding value to the business. I was talking to a CEO client about this recently who, through the work that we've been doing, he went from working 80-hour weeks to now less than 40 hours. And when we met, 80% of his time was spent in the weeds, yet now 95% of it is focused on what only he can do. Yet the battle he's now fighting is he keeps questioning his worth and wondering whether or not he's adding enough value to the business, even though by every metric they've improved and they have plans in place to double in size again over the next few years. The reason he feels that way, though, is because CEO work, like thinking, planning, setting direction, and making key decisions, it has no tangible output. So it doesn't feel like you're being productive. And this is why it's so easy to self sabotage, where you throw yourself back into the weeds where you feel safe, even though it's not where the business needs you right now. The CEOs operating at the highest level, though, they recognize that their value doesn't come from being everywhere. Instead, it's in making sure the business no longer needs them in the wrong places. That's a completely different way of seeing the role, but it's not an easy shift to make because on paper it can all make sense. You can define the role properly, build the right team, put in better systems, and create real accountability. But despite that, you still find yourself back in the middle of everything. It wasn't because the changes were wrong, it was because your identity didn't evolve with the business. I see this a lot with the CEOs I coach where they've read books, they understand the theory, but they still keep finding their way back into the chaos. That's because changing your identity doesn't happen by consuming more information. Because logically, it can all make sense. But if you don't internally change how you think, lead, and view your role, you will stay stuck in your old way of operating. The first step in upgrading your identity is clarity. Because if you don't know the mindset, behaviors, and negative patterns that you're stuck in, then you won't be able to change them. That's why I created the CEO Evolution Assessment. It's a free diagnostic that in 7 minutes will help you uncover where the gap is between how you're currently operating and what the business actually needs from you right now. The link to take it is in the description below. The fifth thing is a hard lesson to accept, especially if it's been keeping you stuck for years. But what nine-figure CEOs know that founders don't is that you have to stop lying to yourself. This is hands down one of the biggest traps I see people stuck in when they first reach out to me for help. And it's also one of the biggest reasons overwhelmed CEOs avoid or delay getting help in the first place. And that is the lie that once something happens, everything will become easier. You may even be in it right now where you keep telling yourself that once that new hire settles in, then you'll get some tasks off your plate. Or that once you get through this quarter, things will start to settle down. Or that once you finish this project, then you can refocus. I've told myself some version of this so many times, so there's no judgment here. But what I've learned is that this is nothing more than a lie we tell ourselves to find comfort in or to justify our actions and decisions today. That's because every new level of success brings with it new levels of problems, challenges, and demands, which is why the calm you're waiting for, it's never going to come. As whatever you're dealing with right now, it's going to be replaced by new things that need your time and attention. Because the same patterns, they just show up again and again, usually bigger and more expensive than before. The CEOs who operate well, though, they understand that, which is why they stop waiting for the calm that isn't coming. And more importantly, they stop using it as the reason to delay taking an action or making a decision they already know that they need to make. That's the real cost of the lie. It's not the story itself, it's everything the story lets you put off. The hard conversation, the restructure, the standards issue, the decision that's already overdue. And that's not even mentioning the personal cost of allowing your relationships to stay disconnected or your health to continue taking a back seat. A lot of the founders I speak to aren't stuck because they're confused about what's wrong. They're stuck because they keep postponing what they already know needs to happen. The best CEOs, though, they're simply more honest with themselves and they're willing to take the uncomfortable actions that are needed to change it. This builds directly into point number 6, and that is that nine-figure CEOs know that you have to do what's best for the business, not what protects your ego or feelings. Because at some point, almost every CEO has to make a decision that disappoints someone. Whether that's a team member who was brilliant in the early days but isn't right for the company now, or a leader who can't grow with the role, or a direction that contradicts what the board wants to hear. Most founders delay these decisions far longer than they should, not because they can't see the issue, but because making the call, it's incredibly uncomfortable, especially when it feels like you're letting someone down, being harsh, or being disloyal. And the more someone leans towards people pleasing, the more every hard decision starts to feel like a verdict on whether or not they're a good person, rather than just a leadership call about what's right for the business. But the CEOs operating at the highest level, they understand that doing what's right for the business, it's going to disappoint people regularly. That's not a personal failing, it's part of the job. That's why one of the biggest takeaways from this video is realizing that you're never going to make everyone happy. And the more that you try, the more pressure you'll keep placing on yourself. It's like not wanting to let go of a team member who's a great fit culturally, yet they're underperforming. For months, you can justify to yourself that maybe they just need more time or they're not that bad, even though deep down, you know that they're not the right fit for the position. The longer you avoid the discomfort, though, the more expensive it gets by the time you finally act. And that cost spreads throughout the team, through standards, through trust, and through your own time, because you end up working around a problem that you should have dealt with directly. That's why the best CEOs, they stop asking, how do I avoid letting people down? And they start asking, what's actually right for the business? And I know that it's hard, but you've got to remember that this is the job you signed up for. You don't have to like it, but you do need to do it. The seventh thing that nine-figure CEOs know is they have to proactively protect their time. Because most overwhelmed founders spend the majority of their week being reactive, where their days are consumed by putting out fires, solving other people's problems, or dealing with whatever seems most urgent in the moment. In fact, whenever I have application calls for my Evolve CEO program, one of the questions I ask is, if you look back on an average day or week, how much of your time was spent in tasks, problems, or situations that weren't actually a good use of your attention? And it's pretty common for the CEOs I speak to tell me that 70, 80, or sometimes even 90% of their time is spent stuck in the weeds rather than working on the business. And you may have seen this yourself, where you go into the week with a plan, then your days get completely derailed. So you reach the end of the week, and despite working 60 to 80 hours and being constantly busy, you don't actually know what you move forward. The problem with being busy all day is it feels productive, which is why the issue is so easy to miss. The worst part about being reactive, though, is it can feel useful. But more often than not, you're being useful in the wrong places, while the work that only you can do, it keeps getting pushed further down the list. That's why top CEOs are highly defensive with their time. They're clear on their roles, their priorities, and the things they need to move forward. And this is why they spend the bulk of their days focused on these tasks and priorities. That's because they know where they're needed in the business, and they don't allow themselves to get pulled into everything else. And chances are, if your days are highly reactive, then it's because you haven't implemented a lot of what I've spoken about so far in this video, in terms of being clear on your role, empowering your team, setting standards, and shifting your identity from being the doer to evolving into the leader. That's what we focus on getting under control in the Evolve CEO program, where I help first-time scale-up CEOs upgrade the way they think, lead, and operate so that they can become the leader their business needs. Because if you're not protecting proactive time, then you're not really leading the business. You're just keeping up with it. The eighth thing that nine-figure CEOs know is that everything you say yes to comes at the expense of something else. Because the reality is every hour has a cost, every yes has a price, and time spent in one place is time that doesn't go somewhere else. The worst part is that often you don't see the trade happening in the moment, especially when you're reacting to problems or doing tasks that you don't realize you should be doing. And that's what happens for so many founders, as they stretch themselves thin across the business. At the end of the day, though, you're either going to be able to do a few things really well or many things mediocre or badly. And this isn't just a business problem, as it extends into every area of your life. Because it's not just focus time on the work of the business that you need, it's time to be present with your family, time to make it to the gym, or to do the things that actually matter to you. I've had so many conversations with scale-up CEOs who have sacrificed everything they have to get to where they are. And inevitably what happens is they find themselves resenting the business and questioning whether or not the sacrifices were actually worth it. And yes, there's a time when you need to hustle, grind, and take on everything if you want to be successful. But once you scale, the cost continues to grow if you don't set the right boundaries, defend your time, or change how you operate. That's why the best CEOs don't just ask whether something needs to get done, they ask whether it needs to be done by them or what it's going to cost if they say yes to it. Using that clarity, they're then highly intentional with what they say yes to and take on, as they know that if they commit to something, something else is going to pay for it. One of the ways I get my private clients to implement this is that once we've defined their role and targets, they then do a weekly audit. Essentially, they go through everything from their to-do list, their schedule, their calendar, meetings, commitments, and everything else they have on. And they ask themselves, is this actually important? Does this need to be done by them? And if not, who could take it over? I've regularly seen with clients that just spending a few minutes on this every week can free up hours, which is time they can then spend working on the things that only they can do. The ninth thing that scale up CEOs know that founders don't is probably the one that's least talked about, but it's also one of the things that can have the biggest impact on the direction of your company. And that is that the people around you, they have their own agenda. Whether it's your board, team, investors, or anyone else with skin in the game for the company, they all have their own wants and desires. And one thing I see with a lot of the first-time CEOs I coach is that they lean heavily on their board and their team for guidance. And it's understandable, especially when you're a founder who's in the role for the first time and you're surrounded by people who on paper are way more experienced than you. So just to be clear, that instinct for guidance is mostly right. And if anything, the CEOs who pressure themselves to have all the answers or to figure it out on their own are often the ones who make short-sighted decisions. Where the problem comes in, though, is when a founder takes guidance at face value without considering what someone else's agenda actually is. For instance, I've had conversations with CEOs who have a clear vision for what they want to achieve, and they know in their gut that to do so, they need to pivot or make some tough calls that will lead to short-term losses. When they take it to their investors, though, they get pushback, as often the investors will want to mitigate risk or get a short-term ROI, even if long-term it isn't the right move for the business. That doesn't make them dishonest or that they should never be listened to, but it does mean that their advice is never fully neutral, even when it's well-intentioned. However, without considering their agenda, a lot of founders, especially when their own confidence is shaky, they end up leaning too heavily on those voices instead of trusting their own read on the business. And that's where it gets dangerous, because if your confidence is low and everyone around you sounds certain, it's very easy to start treating someone else's perspective as more valid than your own. The CEOs who navigate this well, though, they usually have one thing in common. Somewhere in their corner is someone who can challenge their thinking without having a stake in the outcome. Not someone protecting a portfolio or attached to the politics, just someone who can help them think clearly about what's actually right for them in the business. This is in part why my average client stays with me for over 2 years, is our sessions gives them the place to challenge their thinking, break down decisions, and gain new perspectives with no internal agenda, meaning they can talk it through and recalibrate in a judgment-free zone. This is why if you look at a lot of the top CEOs, the one thing they all have in common is they surround themselves with the right support, as they know that they need people in their corner so they don't have to get into the ring alone. So those are 9 things I've consistently seen that separate CEOs operating at the highest level from founders who are still finding footing as they scale. Almost none of them are really about working harder or finding ways to manage your time better. Instead, most of them are about clarity. Clarity on standards, on the role, on identity, on time, decisions, and what you're tolerating, along with what you're avoiding. Because most founders think that growth gets harder because the business needs more from them. What the best CEOs understand, though, is that growth gets harder because the business needs something different from them, and they haven't fully changed with it yet. The biggest takeaway from this video, though, is that the version of you who built the business is not the version needed to scale it. That's because what got you to where you are isn't going to get you to where you want to be. And every new level of success, it's going to require a new level of you. And the CEOs who not just recognize that, but who focus on evolving as they scale, they're the ones who are able to build a company that doesn't cost every piece of them along the way. So if you want to know whether or not you're operating at the level your business currently needs you to, then as a next step, make sure you take my CEO Evolution Assessment. It's a free diagnostic that in 7 minutes will help you uncover if you're evolving at the same pace as the business. And if not, what needs to shift for you to become the leader your business needs. You can find the link in the description below. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Which of these 9 areas stood out to you the most? Let me know your thoughts and questions in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and hit the subscribe button, as every week I put out new videos on how to become a more effective CEO. I've been Byron Morrison. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.